This research paper was given at Newcastle City Library and then the BAFTS conference held at Manchester Metropolitan University in April 2015. It develops on issues around the silencing of women's experiences during and post-conflict by looking comparatively at two case studies from two different chapters in my study, Old Borders, New Technologies, Reframing Film and Visual Culture in Contemporary Northern Ireland. It was part of a panel entitled Performing Women, Visual Representations of Body, Voice and Space that I collaborated on with Fiona Noble, Francisca Sanchez-Ortiz and Lorna Muir. Just as a bit of a warning, there are some references to violence, murder and nakedness in this presentation. The violence in the late 1960s that led to the official outbreak of the conflict, known colloquially as the Northern Ireland Troubles, stemmed from civil rights marches and the British government's response to them. This was a conflict involving the denial of rights and the denial of voicing demand for those rights. The image on the slide shows a gable wall mural in Derry City, County Londonderry, commemorating the marches. The language depicted calls for equal opportunities for employment regardless of a person's religious or community background. Although women are present in the crowd, one of the placards is gendered, notably the one about voting, which of course is one of the fundamental uses of the figurative voice. While a sign of the times, this example of gender imbalance has pervaded every aspect of the conflict, and I would say from lived experience as well as from my research that the exclusion of anyone other than able-bodied heteronormative white men has long been mirrored in the region's politics, society and culture at large. For example, socialist activist Bernadette McCalliskey became the youngest ever MP and the youngest woman to be elected to Parliament at the time after a mid-Ulster by-election in April 1969. She was soon labelled as a firebrand for her outspokenness. She was at the heart of the early civil unrest, and by the end of that year she was convicted of incitement to riot for her role in the Battle of the Bogside, which took place in August 1969. This event led to the deployment of the British Army and the official outbreak of conflict in Northern Ireland. While the young Devlin rose above the parapet and had her voice heard, she quickly became a marginal figure and part of the spectral memory of this history. Yet she has never really gone away and continues to use her voice and whatever platforms she can access to speak for those who are underrepresented, marginalised and unheard. Duncan Campbell's 2008 film Bernadette, made partly with archival images of McCalliskey and partly an imagined or reimagined version of her life story, embodies the issues around mediatising and mythologising and whatever it is you make of her, an iconic individual. It shows ways that the same media that gave her a globally reaching voice just as easily removed that power from her, casting her into obscurity as quickly as it facilitated her notoriety. For example, Campbell's manipulations of the archival footage, such as the still in the slide, visualise McCalliskey's identity, or rather how she is seen via screens, being split beyond her control by people, and that is men, exercising power over how she is presented. Ideas of how women are presented or are mediatised or indeed are fragmented and technologised in these ways emerge in the following comparative case studies in relation to the conflict, rights and autonomy. Regarding film, television and screen studies as institutional subject areas, the works I'm examining are themselves marginalised modes of expression, namely performance and video installation. The first is a response to silenced grieving and the denial of the female voice in Sandra Johnston's 1994 performance installation To Kill an Impulse. The second is Alan Hughes' double-channel audiovisual installation, The Listening Station 2, Counting Backwards, from 2008-9, featuring an automated, disembodied female voice. Largely working in site-reactive live performance, it has been many years since Sandra Johnston has used her voice in her art. In her scholarly writing, she posits that contemporary art perspectives of performativity encompass a hybridization of several artistic approaches: relational, dialogical, and participatory. She identifies a problem with this in that these forms often exclude or reduce the value of the body as an expressive medium outside of verbal language. She explains, performance art continues to regenerate itself predominantly as a body-based, non-verbal form, dependent on its ability to create memorable, embodied images. The kinds of silences developed in performance art are perhaps relevant as a counterpoint to dialogical explorations. The space, in effect, for the rituals of communication to be reconfigured and contemplated separately from the dominance of speech. She argues for bodies and images to be brought into dialogue with one another in such a way that affective connections will be produced, hopefully resulting in cathartic release. But she is aware of the realities of putting this in practice and grapples with them in her book Beyond Reasonable Doubt. More than 20 years post-ceasefire, and at a time in 2017 when issues affecting everyday life are sidelined further by political upheaval in Northern Ireland and across the rest of the UK, it is interesting to take these developments in Johnston's critical engagement with her own practice and look back to one of her earliest performance installations, To Kill an Impulse. Now, I have to note here that given that I was 9 years old when To Kill an Impulse was exhibited in Berlin's Front Art Gallery in 1994, my knowledge of this work is second-hand from reading others writing on it and from speaking about it with Johnston in person. It's a work that she feels little regard for and is one of the reasons why she no longer incorporates appropriated images into her art. The nature of live performance as well is such that it's often difficult to analyse effectively from memory. To Kill an Impulse, though, is an example of a work that was written about thoroughly and about which Johnston has been interviewed at length. Its endurance in art criticism concerning Northern Ireland is indicative of the persistently prescient issues it confronts. To Kill an Impulse was installed in Berlin with the fall of the wall still a fresh memory and some months before the 1994 paramilitary ceasefires in Northern Ireland. It comprised projected slides of stills from media footage of political funerals, opposed against another set of slides rendered from short videos of Johnston's performative response to the murder of Margaret Wright, a woman from a Protestant community who was targeted by loyalists who mistook her for a Catholic. Both sets of slides were projected onto either side of a large dusty pane of glass Johnston found in the gallery's back spaces, and this was placed in the middle of the exhibition space with the slide projectors visible at either side. The projected images converged while the handprints, the dust and the scuffs on the glass added texture and further developed the notion of waste, of disregard and of manhandling. In having to pass through the projector beams, the gallery visitors also became part of this layered image and implicated in the making of meaning. While the body can communicate and connect, here it is Johnston's figurative voicing through non-verbal communication, her protest at the degrading ways women are treated in conflict. The slide set depicting ways that grieving women were framed, hidden or obscured consisted of images extracted from newspaper cuttings and television news broadcasts. Many showed women mourners at Protestant and Catholic paramilitary funerals, depicting their similar experiences without demarcation, treated them as human above denomination and equated their suffering. The snatched glimpses of them also drew attention to their mediation. In some sequences, and that is the series of stills taken from long-distance recordings, when the groups of mourners realise that they're being recorded, the men shield the woman griever from view using their bodies or umbrellas or nearby vehicles. The women's emotional reactions are hidden from public view, but they're also repressed, as the actions appear to stifle their expressions of pain and encourage them to gain composure. In moments such as the one shown on the slide, with the woman doubly framed by the car window and the newspaper photograph, its arrest of this moment affords access to the natural performance of a private grief made public by these two forms of screen. Without visual documentation of the installation, we have to then imagine such an image merging with the stills of Johnston's performance, working through a different kind of trauma which is linked to these mourners through further effects of male sectarian violence. The stills on the other slide set were taken from videos of privately filmed actions Johnston performed using only her body and the waste found in various garbage sites, including large bins, skips, and wasteland covered in fly-tipped rubbish. Johnston had recently experienced a violent attack when residing in East Belfast. This, combined with her anger at Margaret Wright's murder and the dumping of Wright's naked body in a waste bin, were what she was processing as she covered her body in dirty, discarded clothes and objects, working through the psychological ramifications of women's bodies being treated figuratively and literally like rubbish. In reclaiming the body as waste for the autonomous use as both the site and artistic means of communication, To kill an impulse and its cultural memory go beyond criticising or complaining about the abstracted, mediated, victimised female body. Additionally, its mixed media form reflects and helps to create affective connections across space, time and experience. The control of women's grief is related to male violence against women, as both are effects of patriarchal toxic masculinity. Instead of silence being a limitation, in Johnston's work, it transcends the denial of the voice to facilitate and encourage the psychic sharing of trauma that results from male violence. That women find other avenues, including in marginal art forms such as performance art, to communicate this pain is a political act. Remembering in these ways presents complications for state-organised forgetting, that is, the willful exclusion of narratives from official histories. With the rise of women-led victims groups like WAVE, since the 1990s, women have increasingly been portrayed as peacekeepers and mediators, as well as the victims of violence through loss, with each of these identities remaining on the periphery of the conflict's narrative. Even more peripheral are the women who were combatants and prisoners. Still, it remains the work of women to address and repair the damage done to them by men. But even the labour of women carrying this burden post-conflict has experienced a degree of erasure. Northern Ireland experienced nearly a decade of economic growth between the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 and the global economic crash in 2008. In the last nearly 20 years now of official yet very precarious peace, the region has become re-industrialised as a service industry for media and tourism. The establishment and growth of business and commerce initiatives have taken precedence over improving and supporting health services, education, social justice and culture. It is useful then to consider post-conflict work that includes a female voice, but one which is not real and is instead a disembodied, technologised voice. This occurs in Alan Hughes's double-channel audio-visual installation, The Listening Station 2, Counting Backwards. It is a continuation of a single-channel video, The Listening Station, in which Hughes made covertly styled recordings looking in from its periphery towards a British Army surveillance vantage point on Black Mountain, which overlooks Belfast City, and while it was in the process of post-conflict decommissioning. Given the remoteness of the listening stations, it was easy for the public to forget that anyone could be under surveillance at any time. It isn't all about image capture. It's much more ubiquitous than that. It is important to point out the tension that emerges between who is deemed by the authorities as worth listening to during and post-conflict and who is not, whether they identify as victims, survivors, perpetrators or combatants. Women have generally been silenced and excluded. What then do we make of the automated voice in the listening station made 10 years after the agreement? The rhythmic camera work in part 1 is timed to a kind of spoken by an automated female voice. 005 to 004 to 0032 to, and so on and so forth. The second version, subtitled Counting Backwards, engages with the notion of psychic history connected to the recent past, a sense that is achieved by adding a corresponding film to the existing installation. The extended version is screened on 2 separate box monitors pointed at 90-degree angles away from one another. As the installation view shows, only one screen can be viewed at a time. However, the audio comes from the monitor whose screen is obscured from view and which shows blackness, while the visible image is silent. The synchronous but separated audio visuals swap at intervals, which, like Johnston's installation, necessitate the gallery visitors to move around the work. To engage with it, they must actively go between the images and sound sources to perform acts of viewing and listening to piece the work together. The installation view shown on the slide includes a still from the original listening station video. While this video plays, the countdown and dial tones as before play from the speakers in the other monitor. When they swap, the picture shows a series of multi-angled close-ups of a man wearing headphones, while a reassuring soft-toned female voice relays instructions and mental images from the other speakers. The audio could be what the man is hearing, even though there's a separation, but if so, it breaches the public-private boundary. And equally, the instructions might be directed at anyone in the public space, while the soundscape for the man in the image is muted by the headphones, or maybe he's listening to something else. He looks to us like a receiver, but not necessarily of what plays publicly in the gallery space. He always looks off screen, and there is no indication from his facial expression about what he might be hearing, and he appears to passively listen. Given the issues around exclusions of women from the central post-conflict sound and mediascapes, I read this image combined with the voice and the present gallery visitor as embodying and performing the public being given instructions about one thing while controlling forces conduct themselves in private. We cannot know if the messages are the same. Moreover, the female voice catches the listener off guard, I think. Although delivered in a calm, quiet, intimate tone, the instructions the voice relays and how they are phrased could be construed as controlling and aggressive. In her research on the objectifying sonic regime of sound design in American cinema, Liz Green notes the differences between recording male and female voices, pointing out that due to the lack of grain, women must be recorded in more intimate ways. She states, "This allows a very close oral perspective that invites intimacy with the audience. It is the lack of reverberation in space, more commonly perceptible in recordings of men's voices, that allows listeners to feel unrealistically close to the source of the voice." It is useful to bear this in mind when analysing the mechanical female voice in Counting Backwards. It instructs the listener to remember certain events in certain ways, and in doing so actively attempts to control the listener's actions and thought process. The exertion of control over memory resonates with the authoritative production of official histories and cultural memory that manage to erase or negate issues faced in post-agreement society. concerning trauma, victimhood, and the wider ramifications of several decades of intensive state surveillance. Indeed, the notion of truth is slippery when so many former combatants and colluders risk much if certain truths are outed. When they make up many of the people in power, new truths must be fostered and maintained to sustain the status quo. In a mild, generic Northern Irish accent, the disembodied voice tells the listener to view past events through the current psychology of the present. It gives instructions on how to examine personal memories and draws upon the collective contemporary consciousness by urging the unspecified implied listener to act as a neutral observer who views the past as if watching it on television. Such mediatized language and engagement with the past has emerged extensively in work across all art forms concerning Northern Ireland and the conflict since at least the early 1990s. The voice instructs whomever hears it to listen, to let everything become clear, and to become orientated to the memory environment. It asks, where are you? What has happened? The technologized voice, posing rhetorical questions, as well as telling the listener what to think about and in what ways, demonstrates how the public or cultural imaginary can be led by authoritarian voices. The appropriation of the usually stifled female voice in this position gives a false impression of society becoming diverse and moving forward during peacetime, while control being imposed through a formerly repressed type of voice must mean it is for the greater good. However, the voice remains anonymous, it lacks integration with the body, and although it can be heard, it is programmed rather than being real. It is a simulacrum. This voice and its utterances signify the rebranded post-conflict observation, listening, information gathering, and social control exacted by the state. The voice itself is also being controlled. It lacks autonomy and substance. It is performing ventriloquism on behalf of the state. Joseph Honor raises the issue with ventriloquism in his discussion of the use of synthesized post-human voices in contemporary music, but that is tracks featuring computer-programmed voices, and in the case of Moby, for example, making mechanized dance music sing. Honor says this is illustrative of ways that musicians use the technological ventriloquism of these post-human voices to chart the convulsions at the boundaries of race, gender, and the human. If this is the case, then, in a similar way, the post-human voice in the listening station and counting backwards, combined with the image of the man listening or not via audio technology, marks a disruption to the boundaries between sectarian allegiance rather than race, the past, present and future, and time and memory, in addition to gender boundaries and the increasing fusion of the human with technology. Turning to Susanna Loza's points quoted by Honor, she argues that techno-organic entities such as the cyborg, fembot and posthuman traverse the space between desire and dread. Their indeterminate forms simultaneously destabilize and reconfigure the dualistic limits of liberal humanist subjectivity. Bearing in mind that the limits to which Loza refers are those which apply to human technology hybrids and sexualities, and that her article was published at the turn of the 21st century, the concepts and issues the work raises are transferable to the context of a Western post-conflict society emerging at around the same time. In counting backwards, the voice's demands and questions traverse the space between desire and dread in that it entertains the desire and need for memory and for moving on. These desires struggle to coexist. Society cannot move on and forget the past, while some of its members are trapped in perpetual past-presentness, tethered to their sources of trauma. This arrest of memory and time prevents social progression. Only when difficult memories are acknowledged and confronted can social change be facilitated. But this cannot happen due to the prospect of disrupting the complex, stable yet precarious peace in Northern Ireland. In the light of this catch-22 scenario, the voice and its demands and questions do destabilise and reconfigure the dualistic limits of the desire and dread of becoming orientated to the memory environment. An issue with the memory environment in a post-conflict region like Northern Ireland is that memories become so repressed and internalised that whether they are conscious of it or not, subsequent generations carry the burdens of the past, what Marianne Hirsch calls post-memory. As audiovisual archives, including documented artworks and performances, increasingly record and preserve testimonies and memory telling from first, second and third-hand witness accounts, acts of post-memory become blurred with the technologised post-human. In his introduction to The Location of Culture, Homi Bhabha asserts that it is the trope of our times to locate the question of culture in the realm of the beyond, which is neither a new horizon nor a leaving behind of the past. This betweenness is encapsulated in the post-prefix. The writer and cultural commenter Edna Longley has observed that Northern Ireland is only post-conflict in that it's already being archived, it's already being put away in boxes. Its post-millennial archivization is marking it as being after the fact, when the civil rights issues that led to the outbreak of conflict have yet to be satisfactorily addressed. On top of this, its society is now grappling with issues around post-memory and the post-human, the complexities of which invite much deeper investigation. While upon interrogation the mechanized voice in counting backwards has no substance, but instead represents the disembodied friendly voice of the state, the voiceless subjects in Johnston's To Kill an Impulse present an embodied alternative to the denial of the voice. Both works involve covert ways of seeing and encourage different forms of saying and listening that are marginal and resistant to authoritative narratives of conflict and peace. They provide further examples of transgressive approaches to confront the challenges that come with the 21st century and maintaining a delicate peace from within which conflict could easily erupt at any moment. One important point to remember from these works is that silenced bodies can and will find a way to communicate, and beyond the grave if necessary. If you find this presentation interesting or useful, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and share it on your networks. There's a lot more information in the transcription of this talk. If you subscribe to Patreon, you'll get access to it if you subscribe with any amount. If you do feel able to make financial contributions to my freelance research, please donate either in British pounds to paypal.me/PEA Blair, or pledge, as I say, in US dollars on patreon.com/PEA Blair, where there are also links to my other audio recordings, blog and publications, and you can read a bit more about my plans for developing a website and educational resources on audiovisual cultures. Thank you so much for watching. Take care, and I hope very much to see you soon.